The human seat was empty before I reached it. I noticed it the moment I walked into the grand convocation hall, late by 12 minutes because I had been buried in a Vorin transit dispute that refused to resolve itself, and seat 7 was empty. Not delayed, not temporarily vacant, just empty, in the way that something is empty when no one is coming. Ambassador Caroline Holt had represented the human delegation for 4 years. She was the kind of diplomat who made other diplomats feel disorganized simply by existing. She arrived early to everything. She prepared thoroughly for every session, filed her materials in advance, and never once in 4 years had she simply not appeared without explanation. I checked the attendance board. No proxy filed, no notice of absence, no message flagged for the chair, nothing. My assistant S, a young Vorin who had been with my office for 2 cycles, glanced up from his notes when I leaned over, and told him quietly that the human delegation had not logged in. He looked at seat 7. He looked back at his notes. He said they would probably come. They did not come. The session ran 7 hours, and I could not concentrate on most of it. Somewhere in the 4th hour, during a water rights debate between 2 mid-tier species, Pral of the Vorin delegation laughed and said the humans were staging something dramatic over a procedural outcome they disliked, that they would be back within 20 rotations once they had gotten whatever attention they were after. The comment landed well in the room. I did not laugh. I could not explain why, at the time. That was 43 standard rotations ago. No human diplomat returned to the hall after that day. No ambassador. No proxy. No junior staff member standing in for a superior. The human delegation vanished from the grand convocation hall the way a light goes out, and what remained was a clean placard, and a polished chair, and a blank space in the attendance record where a name used to be. After 3 rotations, the council's administrative office sent a formal inquiry. The response came from a man named Oliver Webb, 26 years old, working entry-level correspondence at the human delegation's staff office. His message was polite and precise, and told us nothing at all. The delegation was in an internal review period. They would be in touch about future scheduling. We sent another inquiry. Oliver Webb replied again with the same language in a different sequence. The 3rd inquiry received no reply. After that, silence. Pral maintained his theory through all of this with the comfortable certainty of someone who has never been wrong about anything he paid close attention to. The humans were making a point. They would return. I remember thinking he was almost certainly right. I remember that moment of comfortable assumption very clearly now, because it is the kind of moment that stays with you when you understand what it cost. What started me looking was not suspicion. It was routine. 6 rotations after Caroline Holt's last session, I was clearing out my correspondence archive on a quiet afternoon, moving old files into long-term storage, the kind of administrative work you defer until nothing more urgent forces you to deal with it. I was sorting through a general council correspondence folder when I came across a document that had been sitting in my inbox, unopened, for 19 cycles. The sender was the Human Advisory Office. The subject line read, "Proposal for Revised Emergency Response Protocols." Below it, in the contextual notes field, were 5 words that stopped me completely. 4th submission of this proposal. The 4th. I opened it. 42 pages of thorough, specific, carefully organized analysis. It described in precise detail the gaps in the Council's current emergency response framework. It cited 17 different situations across the previous 3 cycles, where those gaps had produced slow or insufficient responses to real crises. It proposed a revision plan with cost estimates, timelines, and a phased schedule designed around the Council's existing resource constraints. It was, by any reasonable standard, excellent work. I went to the Council's voting records. The proposal had been tabled at each of its 4 submissions, not debated and rejected on its merits, not considered and found insufficient. Tabled, each time, with a procedural note saying it would be returned to in a future session. There was no record of it ever being returned to. I sat at my desk for a while after reading that. Then I started looking for other things the humans had submitted. This took S and me 5 full working days. The Council's archive system is an inheritance from several generations of administrators who each organize things differently, and navigating it requires specific access credentials, produces search results in an order that appears random, and occasionally cannot find documents that clearly exist because other documents reference them. We worked through it carefully and completely. What we found changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. 412 formal submissions from the human delegation across 30 cycles of archived records. I verified that number 3 times. 412. Proposals, technical assessments, formal warnings, budget requests, framework drafts, and policy recommendations in every submission category the Council's process provided for, filed continuously and persistently for 3 decades. There were proposals for updated infrastructure maintenance scheduling, 12 technical reports on the condition of the galactic communications relay network in the outer sectors, filed over 9 cycles, each one more urgent in its language than the one before it. A comprehensive proposal for a shared emergency medical supply network that would have cut crisis response times by an estimated 40%, submitted in cycle 14, tabled, resubmitted in cycle 17, tabled again, and then abandoned in the records. Formal requests regarding the Kreth sovereignty's border movements, filed first as 6, then growing over 12 cycles to 17 total submissions. The most recent sent 2 cycles before Caroline Holt's final session. 17 requests about the Kreth, across 12 cycles, not one resulting in a formal council review. At the end of the 5th day, S found a memo in a misfiled folder, 2 pages, addressed to the council chair's office, sent 2 cycles before Caroline Holt's last session. It described the council's structural failures by name and by proposal number. It said the delegation had used every mechanism available to them over many cycles without receiving substantive engagement on any of it. It requested a formal meeting with the chair to discuss a path forward. It said the window for reform remained open but was narrowing. Below the formal text, below Caroline Holt's signature, in a slightly smaller typeface, was one additional line. It read like something she had added at the very last moment before sending, because she was a person who still believed the right words might reach someone. It said, "We are not leaving because we gave up on this institution. We are leaving because we can no longer pretend that staying is the same thing as being heard." I found no record of a response to that memo, no acknowledgement in the chair's correspondence log, no note in any file indicating anyone had read it. The last document we found in our search was a single-page list, filed under a budget archive heading so plain that S had almost scrolled past it. It was headed Internal Infrastructure Review, Human Advisory Contribution. It contained 47 items. Each one described a council program, system, or piece of operational infrastructure that the human delegation had been actively contributing to. Funding, technical staffing, logistics coordination, maintenance support, direct service provision. I read that list to the end. Then I read it again. Some items I recognized immediately. Several I had to look up. A few I had not previously known existed. By the end of the second reading, I understood what the empty chair in the Grand Convocation Hall actually was. Not a protest, not a political performance. The final result of a very long and very patient process of trying to be heard through every available formal mechanism, none of which had produced a response, ending with the only action left available, which was to stop compensating, through quiet and unacknowledged labor, for the failures that the formal mechanisms had never addressed. The bill was coming. I could feel it before I knew what it would contain. I want to be specific about what those 5 days of searching felt like, because I think that specificity matters to the account. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of discovery that announces itself. It was the slow, uncomfortable experience of opening one document after another and finding, in each one, evidence of a system that had been working against the people trying to work within it. The relay network reports were the ones that stayed with me most during those 5 days. The first of the 12, filed in Cycle 9 of the archived records, was measured and professional in its language. It described degradation patterns in sectors 4 through 11, provided comparative data from prior cycles, and recommended a maintenance review within 2 cycle periods. The language was the language of a technical report that expects to be read and acted upon. The 12th report, filed in Cycle 18, was different. Not in its conclusions, which were the same conclusions amplified by 9 additional cycles of development, but in its tone. It was still professional. But it was professional in the way that someone is professional when they have decided that professionalism is all they have left, that the substance has been exhausted through repetition, and that the only remaining option is to keep the form correct in case someone finally reads it. I read the 12 reports in sequence and watched that shift happen across 9 cycles of technical documentation. It was one of the more quietly distressing things I have read in my professional life. The CRETH warnings had a different character. They were not technical in the same way. They were analytical and forward-looking, and reading them in sequence was like watching someone in the elevated gallery of a building see, from their vantage point, exactly what was about to happen at street level, and try, repeatedly and with increasing urgency, to communicate it to people who could not quite bring themselves to look up. The first submission regarding the CRETH described observed movement patterns and stated that they were consistent with preliminary positioning in preparation for territorial pressure testing. The language was careful. The 6th submission used the phrase pattern of escalating preparatory behavior and cited specific incident dates and locations. The 15th submission described the accumulated picture as constituting a significant and imminent border security concern, requiring formal council attention. The 17th submission, the last one, was 2 paragraphs long. It provided no new analysis because all the analysis had already been provided. It said only that the situation described in the previous 16 submissions remained active, that the pattern had continued to develop, and that the delegation renewed its request for a formal review at the earliest available session. The earliest available session had never included a formal review. I checked. 17 submissions over 12 cycles. Not one had been placed on an actual agenda. I found myself thinking about the person or people who had written the 17th submission, who had sat down to write a document that said, essentially, everything we have already told you 17 times is still true, and filed it, and waited, and eventually stopped waiting. What they had done instead of waiting, I was in the process of discovering, one item at a time. I sent an urgent meeting request to Council Chair Vassal's office. The response came back within the hour. He could see me in 3 days. I used those 3 days preparing the most careful presentation of my career. I organized the information in a sequence that would be difficult to dismiss and impossible to misread. I thought about the room I would be speaking to, and about the specific challenge of making people genuinely receive something they had spent decades not quite receiving, and I prepared for that challenge as thoroughly as I had ever prepared for anything. On the morning of my meeting with Vassal, his office windows looked out over a city that appeared peaceful in the early light. I put my summary on the desk between us and spoke without interruption for 20 minutes. The 412 submissions, the 31 responses, the relay network, the patrol coverage gaps, the resettlement program, Grace Calloway at her clinic seeing 200 patients per rotation and never once sending a bill, Caroline Holt's memo, and the line at the bottom of it. Vassal listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was still for a moment. Then he said, "How serious is this, in your honest opinion?" I told him it was the most serious thing I had encountered in 30 years of this work. He said he would convene an emergency session. I walked back out through his door and stood in the corridor without moving for a while. The building continued its ordinary operations all around me. I had spent 30 years in these corridors believing I understood what kind of place this was. I was beginning to understand how much that belief had been built on a foundation I had never bothered to examine. The emergency session was set for 2 rotations out, and I spent every hour of both days preparing for it. I have given difficult presentations before. I have stood at the mediator's podium in the Grand Convocation Hall and delivered information that no one in the room wanted to receive. I understand how that room works, which arguments land, which delegates find ways around information they do not want to absorb, and how to structure a presentation so that those exits are blocked before anyone reaches for them. But I had never prepared for anything with the precision I brought to those 2 days. because I had never been preparing to make people sit with something they had spent 3 decades successfully avoiding. I arrived at the hall early on the morning of the session. The hall was empty and quiet, the light coming in at the low angle of that early hour, and I stood at the mediator's podium and looked at seat 7 for a few minutes, before anyone else arrived. The placard still read Human Federation. The chair was polished and clean, maintained on its standard schedule by building staff who had received no instruction to treat it differently. I thought about what it had meant when it was occupied, and what it meant now that it was not. The delegates arrived and took their positions. Prahl produced his reading device within minutes of sitting down, which was his signal that he intended to keep the session at arm's length. Yeren, the Polari ambassador, sat with her hands folded and her expression arranged into careful attention. The Kreth observer settled into the elevated gallery above the main floor and positioned himself with the patient attentiveness of someone who had come to hear specific information and was content to wait for it. I noted the Kreth observer and filed the observation separately to return to later. Vassal opened the session and introduced me. I stepped to the podium. I put 412 on the display board first, in large, clear numerals, alone on the board, left there for the room to look at. Then I said that 31 of those 412 formal submissions from the human delegation had received a formal council response. I gave the room a moment. Prahl put his reading device down. I moved through the material in the sequence I had planned. The Emergency Response Framework proposal, submitted 4 times over multiple cycles, tabled each time without debate, never returned to. The 12 technical reports on the relay network in the outer sectors, 9 cycles of increasingly urgent documentation, producing no maintenance action. The 17 formal submissions about the Kreth sovereignty's border activity, filed over 12 cycles, each one logged and set aside without a formal review being initiated. Then I moved to the infrastructure list. I had made a deliberate decision during preparation that this section required the full texture of its specifics. When you give a room the shape of a problem without its details, the room experiences the general outline and keeps its comfortable distance from the actual weight of it. I did not allow that. I gave each of the 47 items in full, describing what it was, what the human contribution had been in practical operational terms, and what the absence of that contribution was producing or would produce. The Communications Relay Support Framework for Sectors 4 through 11, 20 cycles of human technical staffing and operational maintenance, documented only as a single line in a budget filing submitted by a technical officer named Peter Doyle, described as a collaborative arrangement under a cooperation agreement that had expired 14 cycles ago and had never been renewed. The relay nodes in those sectors were degrading. Engineering estimates placed significant multi-node failure within 60 rotations at the current trajectory. The outer rim patrol coverage. The Council maintained an official patrol schedule for the border sectors. The schedule appeared adequate in the documentation. It accounted for approximately 40% of the patrol activity that was actually occurring. The remaining 60% had been provided by human vessels under a standing military authorization, without formal agreement, without announcement, for 12 cycles. Not because anyone had asked, because the humans had seen the coverage gap and filled it. The Dorami Resettlement Processing Program, funded at intended levels for 4 cycles, then budget reduced by 60% when the Council's priorities shifted. The program had continued operating at near original capacity despite the reduction. Administrative reports attributed this to improved efficiency. The efficiency was an 11-cycle human financial contribution from the delegation's trade surplus allocation, appearing nowhere in any document that Council administrators routinely reviewed. I paused between items throughout the presentation, not for dramatic effect, to prevent the information from flowing past the room as a continuous stream that could be survived by not fully stopping on any single piece of it. Then I came to item 47. A human medical officer named Grace Calloway, stationed at a Council relief post in the Dorami resettlement zone. Formal designation, liaison observer. Actual work, documented in the post's own administrative records over 8 cycles. Direct medical care to approximately 200 patients per rotation, because the Council's own medical staffing at that post had never reached the levels its operational guidelines required, and the people who needed care were there, and she was there. and the work therefore needed doing. No bill submitted, no reports filed that would have surfaced what she was doing to anyone reviewing things from the council's end. She appeared in the post's records as a constant background presence, the way permanent furniture appears in administrative notes, named without comment or explanation because she had simply always been there. She left the post 14 rotations ago. The clinic's records since her departure showed a 63% reduction in patients seen per rotation. The post administrator had filed a staffing assistance request, 6 rotations after she left. The request was logged in the council's medical bureau. Its status was pending review. I looked around the room and said, the humans did not do these things to create leverage. They did not involve themselves in our systems in order to engineer the situation we are now facing. They did these things because the work needed doing, and no one else was doing it. They were doing this work while simultaneously filing formal requests through every channel available to them, asking the council to take responsibility for these functions itself, asking us to function the way we were supposed to function. We did not respond, so they kept doing the work. And then, after many cycles of this, they stopped attending sessions and stopped answering our communications, and now we are discovering, one item at a time, what they were quietly holding up while we were not paying attention. Prahl made the argument I had expected him to make, in the tone of someone who had prepared it carefully. The humans had chosen to involve themselves in council systems without formal authorization. They had not disclosed the full extent of that involvement. They had timed their departure for maximum disruptive effect. The logical reading of the evidence, he said, was that this had been deliberate strategy. I told him I had considered that interpretation seriously. Then I told him about Grace Calloway. 8 cycles, 200 patients per rotation. The bill that was never sent. I said, there is no strategy in that. There is a person who saw work that needed doing and did it. That is what I found across all 47 items on this list. And those people, for 3 decades, filed formal requests through every available channel, asking the council to join them in doing this work. We did not join them, so they stopped. The session ran 3 more hours. Arguments, counter-arguments, a genuine shouting exchange between 2 secondary delegates that Vassal had to interrupt. Yaron asked the most practically focused questions of any delegate in the room, concentrated on the relay timeline and what we actually had available to address it. I gave her precise answers. At the close of the session, Vassal called for a formal response committee and asked me to chair it. As the room emptied, I looked up at the gallery. The Kreth observer was gone. He had left quietly at some point during the latter portion of the session. He had been present when I described the relay vulnerabilities. He had been present when I laid out the patrol coverage gaps. He had been present when I mapped, in comprehensive detail, exactly what the council's defenses looked like with the human presence removed. He had taken everything he came for and left without a word. I turned off the display board. On it I had left Isoparov. The walk from the Grand Convocation Hall back to my office after the emergency session took longer than it should have, not because of distance but because I stopped twice in corridors without being sure why I had stopped. The second time, outside the Document Services office on the 3rd floor of the administrative wing, I stood for a moment and looked at the notation above the door that said, Council Archive Access, and thought about 47 items, and the list they had come from, and what it meant that the list had been filed 11 cycles ago and had never been reviewed by the Council's own infrastructure office in all the time since. It was filed correctly. It was properly categorized. It sat in an archive that was accessible to anyone with standard administrative credentials, under a heading that was clear enough once you knew to look for it. The problem was that no one who would have understood what it described had known to look for it, because the document had been submitted to a general inbox and logged and filed without anyone recognizing that its contents described a significant structural situation. The council had not failed to notice the 47 items because the information was hidden. It had failed to notice because the institution had not been organized in a way that required anyone to notice. And when you are not required to look at something, the human tendency, and the Voron tendency, and the tendency of most organized beings who have other things to do, is to not look at it. That was the thing I kept returning to as I stood in that corridor outside the Document Services office. Not the malice of it, because I did not think malice was the explanation. the institutional structure of it. The way a system that is not designed to surface certain information reliably will not surface it, regardless of the quality or the urgency or the accuracy of the information itself. S found me still in the corridor when he came looking for me 10 minutes later. He did not ask why I was standing outside the document services office. He told me, in the practical way he managed information when he could tell I was occupied with something else, that 3 delegation representatives had sent messages requesting briefing sessions, and that my office had 2 other pending items from before the session that had not yet been addressed. I told him to schedule the briefings and that I would attend to the other items in the morning. He nodded. Then, after a pause, he asked whether I was all right. I told him I was thinking about filing systems. He said that sounded like a reasonable thing to think about, given the day. It did not sound reasonable, but it was what I was thinking about, and he was generous enough not to push it further, as the final visible image, a map of the outer sectors showing the patrol coverage that human vessels had been providing, outlined clearly. The outline covered the entire border zone adjacent to Kreth sovereignty territory. I walked out of the empty hall and thought about how long 14 rotations actually was, and how much planning could be done in 14 rotations by people who had been given a comprehensive assessment of the opportunity in front of them. The first infrastructure failure came in 31 rotations, not the 60 my engineering estimate had projected. The estimate had been built on assumptions about baseline maintenance levels that turned out not to reflect reality. The human technical framework had been compensating for a gap between how the relay network was supposed to be maintained and how it had actually been maintained for years, and in the framework's absence, the gap produced results faster than any model built on the false baseline could have calculated. Sector 7's secondary relay node went dark over the course of 4 hours. 6 inhabited systems lost full communications capability in that time. The engineering team that reached Sector 7 found a node that had been operating beyond its tolerance thresholds for what they estimated was several cycles. The components that failed were not on our standard maintenance checklist, because the checklist had been written for a system maintained at specification. The human technical framework had been maintaining the functional result despite the deficit. With the framework gone, the deficit became real, in the way deficits become real, when they can no longer be compensated for. The repair was manageable. That was not the problem. 23 other nodes existed in varying degrees of the same condition. We had known this as an abstract fact since my presentation. We knew it now in the concrete, specific, immediate way that comes when something is actively failing while the response team is still assembling. 3 rotations later, the Kreth Sovereignty sent 3 vessels into the Naren Corridor. The Naren Corridor was contested space managed for 40 years through an informal arrangement sustained by consistent patrol presence from both sides. Every proposal to formalize this arrangement had been tabled. In practice, it had held, because patrol presence made it hold, and because the human component of the Council's patrol presence in that stretch had been, for 12 cycles, far larger than the official record reflected. 3 vessels became 6, then 9. Slow, deliberate movement in numbers that had not been there before, at a moment when the mechanism that had historically made their presence there impractical no longer existed. The response committee convened. A delegate named Saul asked whether we should activate the standard border response protocol. The protocol was well designed, drafted by the Human Delegation's Security Advisory Team 11 cycles ago. Its opening procedure required a coordination signal through the emergency relay network to mobilize the designated regional response fleet. The emergency relay network ran through Sector 7. Sector 7 was offline. The regional response fleet for the affected area was 3 vessels, all overdue for equipment maintenance that had been deferred through successive budget cycles. I told the committee I would have an options assessment ready the following morning. I dismissed the session and sat alone in the empty room for a while. I was thinking about the Kreth observer in the gallery, sitting through my presentation of relay vulnerabilities and patrol coverage gaps, and the precise timeline of the human departure that had left both exposed. I was thinking about 14 rotations, and how long that actually was when you were planning something. I was thinking about 17 formal warnings filed by Caroline Holt's delegation about the Kreth, across 12 cycles. and about what those warnings had described. The following morning I met with the Resettlement Bureau director, a conscientious Durrami named Ulan, and told him what I had found regarding the Durrami processing program. He had not known. The information had not been present in any document his office routinely reviewed. He was genuinely troubled in the open way of someone receiving real new information, not performing the management of a position he had already committed to. 2 processing stations had filed distress notifications. He authorized emergency direct support within the hour, faster than standard process allowed. On the 7th day after Sector 7 failed, the Kreth Sovereignty sent a formal diplomatic communication to the chair's office. It was politely worded and correctly formatted, and said they had assumed a temporary administrative presence in the Naren corridor for purposes of regional stability, and that they looked forward to discussing the matter through appropriate channels. Vassal called me before I finished reading it. I told him we had less time than we thought, and that we needed to find the humans. He said, "Go." I left the council district on a diplomatic carrier named the Arvin, and I did not look back. I had S with me, a communications archive containing every human diplomatic record we held access to, and a formal letter from the full council, signed by Chair Vassal, and acknowledged by every member delegation. I had written most of that letter myself and had spent more time on it than on almost anything I had written in 30 years, because I understood that what it said, and how it said it, would determine whether the people who read it believed it was real or treated it as one more piece of institutional paper. The Arvin was a mid-range carrier, reliable and fast enough, without the heavy formal insignia of an official diplomatic vessel. That was deliberate. I did not want to arrive announcing myself before I arrived. We flew toward human space, and I stood at the observation port on the 2nd day and thought about what I expected to find. The scans began returning data as we crossed into the outer human systems, and the data was nothing like what I had assumed. I had expected contraction, a people who had stepped back from the galactic stage, managing with fewer external connections, sustaining themselves at a reduced level while political circumstances developed. Some visible cost from the withdrawal of trade relationships and partnership arrangements that had existed during their council membership. The outer human systems were producing at levels that exceeded anything in our comparative data from their council membership period. Shipping traffic between human worlds was dense and efficiently organized. 3 separate systems showed construction signatures consistent with major building programs reflecting long-term investment and planning. Power generation readings across 4 major human worlds were consistent with sustained, significant industrial activity. I asked S to compile every available economic indicator and compare current figures against those from the cycle before the humans stopped attending sessions. He presented his findings at our working table the following morning. The picture they formed was clear, and required me to sit with it for a while before I responded. The resources the humans had been directing outward, toward council programs and joint infrastructure and the systems they had been quietly supplementing, had been redirected inward. The medical polymer shortage that the human delegation had been trying to get the council to address for 3 full cycles was gone. S found the documentation in a public human government archive, openly accessible, describing a new manufacturing process developed in the 2nd cycle of their withdrawal. They had resolved the shortage internally within 2 years of leaving. The infrastructure investments their own citizens had not seen, because resources were flowing outward, were now underway across multiple worlds. Every indicator pointed the same direction. They had not struggled from leaving. They had recovered. S spread the information across the table between us and said, quietly, that they had been asking the council to help them address problems they were going to solve on their own regardless. I said they had been asking the institution to work the way it was supposed to work, not because they required it to, because a governing body that sustains itself on the quiet, unacknowledged labor of its members, while ignoring those members' formal requests, cannot function as a governing body indefinitely. They had understood this longer than we had. S was quiet for a moment. Then he said that they had been supporting the council at cost to themselves while the council dismissed everything they formally submitted. I said yes. The response to our contact request came from an office I had not previously encountered in our records. The Department of External Inquiry, signed by its director, a woman named Margaret Osei. She was available at Lismore Station, a civilian administrative hub at the edge of human space, easily reached from either side of the boundary. The meeting would be informal and exploratory. No collective decisions had been made. Lismore Station was built into the side of a planetoid and was smaller than I had pictured. Functional, well-maintained, with wide observation windows looking out on a field of ice formations drifting in the gravity of a distant star, catching and scattering its light in slow patterns that moved across the interior dock surfaces as the formations rotated. We were the only council vessel in the bay. I noted this without drawing conclusions from it. Margaret Osei met us in a plain room, with a long table, chairs, and a window with a view of the ice field. She shook my hand in the human manner, offered tea, and sat down across from me with the composed stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning to hold strong feelings without letting them direct the conversation. She looked at me directly and asked why I had come personally. She said it was a genuine question. The letter explained what the council wanted. She wanted to understand what I wanted. I told her about item 47, about Grace Calloway and the Relief Post Clinic, and the 200 patients per rotation, and the bill that was never sent. I told her I had spent 30 years in council work believing I understood what the institution was, and that one entry in a budget archive had made me understand I had been fundamentally wrong about something. I told her I had come in person because a formal delegation was not the right instrument for what I needed to say, which was that I was sorry, and that I believed the council could be something different from what it had been, and that I was not certain those two things were sufficient, but they were where I had to start. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that was a more honest answer than she had expected. She poured more tea, and we talked for 4 hours. She was precise and direct, and never unkind, and she did not pretend the situation was simpler than it was. She described the Civic Assembly's ongoing internal discussion about the council, and what relationship with it, if any, served human interests. She said the decision would be the Assembly's to make, through its own process, on its own timeline, and she would not try to compress it. She named 2 conditions. The first was a genuine constitutional reform process, initiated by the council itself, not managed or overseen by humans but real in all the ways that mattered. Independently arbitrated, documented with full transparency, no predetermined outcomes protecting the existing arrangement of power. The second was public acknowledgement, a full, specific, factual account transmitted across the council's communication network to every member system, describing what the human delegation had actually been doing across the preceding decades, what the 47 items on that list had actually meant in operational terms, and what the council's consistent failure to engage with human proposals had actually cost. I asked her why the acknowledgement specifically, why that condition alongside the structural one. She said, because other species in your council have also been raising concerns and being ignored. They need to know that their experience is real, and that someone has finally seen it. The humans were not the only ones trying to be heard. We were better resourced and therefore able to sustain the compensatory work for longer. But we were not unique in being dismissed. Your council needs to understand that clearly. That was larger than I had anticipated and entirely right. I asked whether, if both conditions were met, humanity would consider returning to full membership. She said she could not answer that on behalf of the Assembly, but she said they had not stopped caring about what happened in the galaxy they lived in, and that caring about something and permanently turning away from it were 2 different things. She said they would stabilize the immediate situation, the Naren corridor, the relay network, the processing stations. Once, not as leverage and not as a transaction, but because living beings were at risk, and the Kreth moving through the Naren corridor was a problem for everyone, including humans. But if the council used that assistance to buy time and return to the previous arrangement rather than genuinely reform, then whatever they did in the near term would be the last contribution they made, not from anger, from the understanding that nothing would have changed, and there was no value in acting as though it had. At the door, as S and I were leaving, she paused. She said Grace Calloway had heard about this meeting and had asked about it. She said she hoped things improved. I did not produce adequate words. so I said nothing, and I think that was the right choice. I walked back through the docking bay and stood at the observation port of the Arvin for a long time, watching the ice formations drift in the light of the distant star, before I asked Doss to take us home. The journey to Lismore Station gave me more time to think than I had had in the weeks prior, and I used it in ways that were not always immediately productive but were, I believe, necessary. I thought about Oliver Webb, the 26-year-old who had written the careful, uninformative responses to our inquiries. I had looked him up when his name first appeared in the correspondence, and found a recent graduate in an entry-level position, the kind of role that handles routine correspondence, so that people with substantive work can focus on it. When the human delegation decided to leave, someone had made a deliberate choice about how to handle the incoming inquiries from the council. The choice they made was to route them to Oliver Webb, not to a senior policy officer, not to anyone whose presence in the correspondence would signal that the response was important, to a young man with polite language that said nothing, deployed precisely and repeatedly. I had read this choice, in the early weeks, as evidence of dismissiveness. The council is asking serious questions and you send an entry-level staffer's form reply. But on the Arvin, flying toward Lismore Station, I understood it differently. The human delegation had spent 4 years with Caroline Holt, filing formal submissions and formal warnings through every available channel. None of those submissions had been acknowledged in any substantive way. The institutional message, delivered consistently across dozens of interactions over many cycles, was that the quality and substance of what the humans sent did not matter, because it was not going to be read or acted upon regardless of who sent it, or how carefully it was composed. Oliver Webb was the delegation's institutional answer to that institutional message. If what you send does not matter, then who sends what you send does not matter either. It was not dismissiveness. It was a mirror held up at arm's length. I needed to sit with that interpretation for a while before I could think clearly about what came next. What came next was Lismore Station, and Margaret O'Say and the 4-hour conversation I have already described. But what I have not described is the way the conversation settled into my understanding on the return journey, as I reread my notes in the cabin of the Arvin, with the outer sectors moving past the observation port, in the slow way of deep space. The conversation had been honest, in ways that formal diplomatic conversations are not usually honest, and what it had been honest about was not just the 2 conditions or the Assembly's deliberations, or the specific terms of the stabilization offer. It had been honest about what the situation had cost. Margaret O'Say had not said anything melodramatic. She was not a person who expressed things melodramatically, but in the specific, precise language she had used to describe the human population's relationship to the council question, in the description of the voices within the Assembly that wanted permanent separation, and the voices that wanted some form of renewed engagement, and the difficulty of holding those 2 positions in the same deliberative process, there was a weight that I recognized as the weight of real cost. They had been hurt by this. Not injured in a way that needed to be performed or presented. Hurt in the ordinary, private way of people who believed in something, and found that the something did not believe in them the same way, and then had to decide what to do with that discovery. The fact that they had decided to offer the stabilization assistance anyway, the fact that Margaret O'Say had said they had not stopped caring about the galaxy they lived in, carried a different weight in the context of that cost than it would have carried without it. I wrote in my notes on the second day of the return journey that the council had been given something it had not earned, and that the question of whether it would earn it going forward was the most important open question in the next several months of my professional life. S., working on his own summary at the other end of the cabin table, looked up once while I was writing that and did not say anything. He had the quality, which I had come to value, of understanding when something did not require a response. On the return journey, 3 days, I wrote careful notes about everything Margaret O'Say had said and everything the scans of the human systems had shown. I wanted the record precise. I had learned recently what imprecision in records cost, and I was not going to contribute to that kind of cost. S. worked alongside me through the return flight. On the second day, without looking up from his work, He asked whether I thought the council would accept both conditions. I said it depended on whether the people in that room could be honest with themselves about what accepting meant. He thought about this. Then he said that was probably true of most important decisions. I said it was. I stood at the mediator's podium in the Grand Convocation Hall for the second time in less than a month, and this time I did not soften a word. I had promised Margaret Osei I would deliver her conditions exactly as she had stated them, and I kept that promise. I gave the room the two conditions, the constitutional reform process and the public acknowledgement, in the language she had used, in the sequence she had used, without the softening that I might have applied in other circumstances to make difficult information more palatable to people I would need to keep working with afterward. The information was what it was. The room needed to receive it without a cushion. The session was long and contested in the specific way that sessions become contested when people are being asked to accept something that requires them to change their understanding of themselves. Propol made his arguments across several installments, logically organized and insufficient against the actual record. Several delegates expressed particular discomfort with the public acknowledgement requirement. One said it amounted to the council admitting failure in front of the entire galactic community. I said the council had failed in specific and documented ways, that the full galactic community had a right to know this, given that those failures had affected member systems throughout the council's territory, and that the question of whether acknowledgement was comfortable was not the same question as whether it was necessary. A delegate with connections to the Kreth sovereignty characterized Margaret Osei's conditions as coercive interference. I responded to this calmly, which required more deliberate effort than it should have. Vassal held the session together. He is a slow and procedurally minded chair, and there are situations where that quality works against the moment. This was not one of those situations. He let every argument run to its natural conclusion, without intervening to smooth anything over before the information had actually landed. When the arguments were exhausted and the hall had settled into the particular quiet of a room that has run out of counterpositions, he said, "We can debate whether what is being asked of us is fair, or we can discuss whether what we have been doing was fair. Those are two different conversations. Only one of them will lead anywhere." The vote to accept both conditions was not unanimous. It was not close either. One thing I want to note about the period following the full council vote, because it belongs in an honest account of how things developed, is that not everyone who voted to accept the conditions was acting from the same motivation. Some delegates voted to accept because they genuinely understood what I had described and were genuinely moved by it. I believe Yeren was in this group. I believe Horrell was in this group, based on the message he sent me 3 days after the vote that said, simply, that he had read the infrastructure list again and was glad we were doing something about it. Some delegates voted to accept because they had calculated that accepting was the only realistic option, and that the conditions, while uncomfortable, were manageable in the specific sense of being survivable without fundamentally threatening their position in the council's political structure. I believe Prahl was in this group, initially, though I think he moved over time towards something more honest than that calculation. And some delegates voted to accept because they did not vote against, which is a different thing, and because the alternative was being publicly recorded as having refused conditions that the council chair was personally endorsing, and that was a political cost they were not willing to pay. I make these distinctions not to judge the motivations, but because they mattered for what happened in the weeks that followed the vote. The delegates who were voting from genuine understanding were the ones who showed up to the acknowledgement document editing sessions with substantive contributions and minimal obstructionism. The delegates who were voting from calculation were the ones whose representatives showed up to those sessions with proposed qualifications that needed to be declined, and the delegates who had voted not to vote against were largely absent from the editing process altogether, which had the practical effect of not requiring me to spend time on them, but which also meant that when the document was finalized, some of those delegates would look at it and find it more extensive than they had anticipated. I prepared for that. I knew the acknowledgement would read harder to some people than the vote to accept had suggested, because the vote had been relatively abstract and the document was specific. I had conversations in the week between the vote and the start of the editing process with several senior delegates, reminding them of what we had committed to and why, and what it would mean to produce a document that honored that commitment rather than performing it. Not all of those conversations were comfortable. That was appropriate. The one that I found most significant was not with a senior delegate, but with a member of the council's administrative staff, a mid-level records officer who came to see me one afternoon, apparently on her own initiative, to tell me that she had read the account of the 47 items and wanted me to know that she had been filing the human delegation submissions for 11 cycles and had not known, until the emergency session, what they contained or what their status was. She said this without defensiveness and without excessive distress. She was presenting a fact she thought I should have. I told her I appreciated her coming to tell me, and that what she had described was the result of a system that had not been designed to surface that kind of information, and that the person responsible for that was not the records officer filing submissions in the category they were submitted under. She nodded. Then she asked whether there was anything she could do differently going forward. I told her that under the new administrative procedures being developed as part of the reform process, there would be a formal escalation mechanism for submissions that had not received a response after a specified period, that it would be part of her job, and every records officer's job, to flag those for senior review, that the system would be designed so that the filing of documents and the substantive review of documents were connected in a way they had not previously been. She said that sounded right. She left, and I made a note to include that specific mechanism in the Reform Committee's first working agenda, which I had been preparing. The note was already on a draft list, but I moved it to the top. The public acknowledgement document took 2 full weeks to finalize. Every word required agreement across the member delegations. I wrote the core sections myself and held the specific details in place through the editing process. The count of tabled proposals was in the document. The 47 items were in the document, described with the same specificity I had used in the emergency session. Grace Calloway's name was in the document. The relay network's condition was in the document. The patrol coverage gap was in the document. Everything that needed to be said was said, without reduction. The document was transmitted across the Council's full communications network to every member system. Responses came back over the following rotations, from directions I had expected and some I had not. The one that stayed with me longest was from the Mareth delegation. The Mareth were a small species whose border colonies had been experiencing resource allocation failures for 8 cycles, and who had been filing formal concerns about those failures with the Council, for all 8 of those cycles, without receiving anything that could honestly be called engagement. Their message to the chair's office was brief. The final line said, "We are glad someone said it." I forwarded that message to Margaret Osei. She replied with 2 words. The human stabilization response arrived 22 rotations after the assembly convened, 8 rotations ahead of the projected timeline, which Margaret Osei noted in her cover message without elaborating on further. The response document was 40 pages of specific, practical planning. It described exactly what assistance would be provided to the relay network, to the Nairn corridor situation, and to the processing stations, along with comprehensive information transfer protocols for each area, so that the Council's own teams would be equipped to maintain these systems going forward. I want to be honest about something that happened in the weeks between the vote and Margaret Osei's stabilization response arriving, which I have not yet described fully. There was a period of approximately 10 days, during which the situation in the Nairn corridor was deteriorating, and the relay repair schedule was running behind initial projections, and the processing stations were still operating below capacity. And during those 10 days I did not know whether the Council had done enough. Not whether we had done the right things in principle. I believed we had. I believed the vote and the acknowledgement and the reform process were the right response. What I did not know was whether we had done them in time. The Creth had 14 vessels in the Nairn corridor by the 9th day. The patrol fleet we had available was 3 vessels in a corridor that had historically required a substantially larger presence to maintain its neutral status. I was receiving daily situation reports from the Security Coordination Office, and each one described the Creth vessels as maintaining position and not engaging in any overtly aggressive activity, and each one also described the pressure of 14 vessels in a contested passage as a situation that was sustainable for a limited time at most. On the 9th day, I received a message from Vassal, asking for my honest assessment of the timeline if the human stabilization response was delayed or did not come at all. I wrote a response that I did not send immediately. I wrote it, read it, and then sat with it for a while. The response was honest, and the honesty of it was difficult. Without the human assistance offer, the relay network would remain degraded for at least another 6 months. Without the relay network, the security response protocols for the Naren corridor situation were severely compromised. Without functional security protocols, the Kreth's position in the corridor would become increasingly difficult to address through standard council mechanisms. The processing stations would continue to degrade. 2 of the other items on the 47 list that I had not yet fully addressed would likely reach critical status within 40 rotations. The honest assessment was that the council had made the right decision, and that the right decision might not have arrived in time to prevent significant harm. I sent the assessment. Vassal replied that he understood and asked me to continue the work. That was on the 9th day. On the 12th day, the human stabilization response arrived, 22 rotations ahead of schedule, because the assembly had moved faster than the projected timeline, because whatever internal discussion had been underway had reached its conclusion sooner than Margaret Osei had expected. I was in my office when S brought me the notification. He put it on my desk without a word, and I read it, and then I read it again. 40 pages. Specific. Complete. Including the information transfer protocols. I sent a message to Vassal. I sent a message to the Security Coordination Office. I sent a message to Dre's engineering team with the relevant sections of the relay documentation attached. Then I sat at my desk for a while and thought about what it meant that it had arrived. Not just that it would help, though it would, but what it meant that people who had left, who had every reason to let the council experience the full consequences of what it had been doing, had nonetheless chosen to come back in this limited way, because living beings were at risk. Margaret Osei had said it at Lismore Station. They had not stopped caring about the galaxy they lived in. I believed her when she said it. I believed it more, and differently, on the 12th day. The Naren corridor resolved in 4 rotations. Human vessels appeared in the corridor in numbers, and with an organizational precision that communicated everything necessary, without requiring any formal statement. The Kreth Sovereignty's fleet, which had grown to 14 vessels by that point, withdrew in good order over the following rotation. No exchange of communications between the 2 sides was required. No formal engagement, no announced terms. The corridor returned to neutral status and held there. I wrote in my personal records that evening that I had spent 30 years in council work and had never seen a security situation resolve with that combination of speed and economy. I had never seen it because I had spent those 30 years looking at the architecture of formal diplomatic process and not at the underlying practical reality those processes were supposed to serve. The week after the vote to accept both conditions was one of the most technically demanding weeks I had experienced in council work, because accepting the conditions was the easy part, and everything that followed the acceptance was not easy. The public acknowledgement document was the immediate challenge, because the timeline for it was short, and the requirement for complete consensus across the member delegations was real and non-negotiable. I had written the core sections quickly because I had been living with the material for weeks and knew exactly what needed to be said. The challenge was the editing process, which required sitting in a series of meetings with delegation representatives, who each had their own concerns about specific language and who needed to be persuaded, one by one, that the specific concern they were raising was either already addressed or was a concern that the acknowledgement could not accommodate without undermining its honesty. Prowl's delegation proposed, 3 times across 2 days of editing sessions, language that would have introduced qualifications into the description of the council's failures that I believed would have changed the meaning of the document in ways that were not acceptable. I declined each proposal and explained each time why I was declining it. On the 3rd occasion, Prowl looked at me across the editing table for a moment before he spoke. He said, "You understand that this document is going to be read by species that have members who sit in this council, and that what it says about the council's record is going to affect how those species think about their participation here." I said that I understood that. and that it was precisely why the document needed to be accurate and complete. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was not arguing for inaccuracy. He said he was trying to understand whether the document I was proposing was designed to create genuine change or to produce a record of accountability that satisfied an external demand without producing anything structural. It was a fair question. It was the sharpest question Prahl had asked me in the entire preceding period, and I told him so. I told him that the acknowledgement was one of two conditions, not the only one, that the structural change was the constitutional reform process, which was the other condition and which was already being planned. That the acknowledgement was not a substitute for structural change, but a prerequisite for it, because you cannot change something you have not agreed to look at directly, and that the Marath and the other species who had been trying to raise concerns through formal channels for years deserved to have someone say, publicly and specifically, that what they had experienced had been real, and that the Council understood what it had produced. Prahl was quiet again for longer this time. Then he said that he did not object to the document in principle, that he had concerns about implementation that he wanted to raise through the appropriate committee structure, and he withdrew the third proposed qualification without further argument. I found that exchange more significant, in retrospect, than it felt at the time. The acknowledgement document went out to every member system on a standard transmission day, bundled with the regular Council communications package in a way that made it impossible to miss and easy to find in the archive. I had insisted on that. It was not sent as an attachment to a cover message. It was its own document, with its own header, addressed to the Council community. The Marath message came back 4 rotations later. There were others, from species I had not expected to hear from, several of which described situations that paralleled the human experience in ways that were not identical, but were recognizable. Species that had been filing concerns for years and receiving no substantive response. Species that had been quietly filling gaps in Council programs because the programs were not adequately resourced and the people affected by the programs were real. Species that had concluded, variously, that they were not being heard, or that being heard was not something the Council's structure made possible, and that had adjusted their behavior accordingly. Reading those messages over the course of the week that followed the transmission was one of the more important things I did during that period. It was important not because the situations were the same as the human situation, because they were not identical, but because they confirmed what Margaret O'Say had said at Lismore Station. The humans were not the only ones who had been trying to be heard. They were the ones who had been most visible in leaving, because they had been most visible in what they were sustaining before they left. I forwarded the most significant of those messages to Owen Clark at the liaison office with a note. He replied to each one. I found out later that in several cases he had arranged follow-up conversations between the liaison office and the delegations involved. He had done this without being asked, and without making it a formal process, because he was a person who understood that some of the most important conversations happen outside the formal structure. I added that to the list of things I was noticing about Owen Clark that suggested he was the right person for the position he was in. The relay network restoration was an ongoing process throughout this period, and I want to include it specifically because it illustrates something about the difference between having information and using information that I think is worth preserving in the record. The human technical documentation that our engineering teams were working from was, as Dre had noted, comprehensive. It covered not just the repair procedures for the degraded components, but the broader maintenance architecture that should have been in place, the inspection cycles, the performance monitoring thresholds, the component replacement schedules. It was the documentation of a system being maintained correctly, written by people who had been maintaining it correctly for 20 cycles without those maintenance records being part of any document that the Council's own infrastructure office routinely reviewed. Working from that documentation, Dre's teams repaired not just what had failed, but what was on the verge of failing, and in doing so discovered, in nodes that had not yet produced alerts, degradation patterns at early stages that would have become failures within the next several cycles. They addressed those as well. By the time the schedule was complete, they had done significantly more work than the initial assessment had suggested would be needed. Because the initial assessment had been based on what they knew was degraded, and the documentation showed them how much more had been developing in the background. Dre included a note in his final report that I have kept. It said that if the documentation had been available to the Council's infrastructure office from the beginning of the human technical support arrangement, the failures that triggered the crisis would have been preventable, but that having it now and using it properly would prevent comparable failures going forward, which was not nothing. It was not nothing. That was accurate. I had that note on my desk for a long time. The relay network repairs took months. Council engineering teams worked from human technical documentation through a rolling schedule of node repairs. The documentation was comprehensive. The lead engineer Dre noted this in his progress reports with increasing specificity as the work continued, observing at one point that the materials they were working from had clearly been prepared by people who expected them to be used. By the time the last node in the initial repair schedule returned to full operation, the teams doing the work understood the network in a way they had not understood it before, in the applied, durable way that comes from doing the work rather than reviewing documentation about it. The processing stations stabilized within a month, through emergency budget authorization, combined with a supplementary resource contribution proposed personally by Yeren, and passed through committee faster than anything comparable in my memory of the Council's processes. Other delegations made additional contributions in the weeks following the acknowledgement document's transmission. Something had changed in how people were willing to be seen. The tendency toward waiting for circumstances to force the minimum necessary action was not gone, but it had been interrupted, and the interruption had produced something real. The constitutional reform process opened formally 6 cycles after the vote. Vassal selected 3 neutral arbiters from non-council species. The first working session produced a scope document longer and more substantive than the opening documents of any comparable process I had seen in 30 years of council work. Prahl attended every session and argued his points when he had points to argue, and stayed in the room when he lost the arguments. That was all the process asked of him. It was more than I had been fully confident he would manage. 8 cycles into the reform process, Prahl requested time to address the full assembly and was given it. He used that time to say that the council had for a long time rewarded inertia, and that he had been among its most consistent practitioners of inertia, and that he was not proud of it. He said this with the specific, controlled deliberateness of someone who has spent a long time working toward an honest thing, and is determined to say it correctly, even when it reflects badly on themselves. I was in the gallery during that speech. I found myself looking away near the end of it, which is not something I normally do during sessions in that hall. The Human Liaison Office opened in the administrative wing shortly after the reform process began. 3 staff members, a communications center, a comfortable room on the eastern side of the building with windows facing the city. The director was a man named Owen Clark, who had an apparently genuine and unlimited interest in actually knowing the people he was being introduced to. He spent his first week in the building finding every senior official he could and introducing himself, and the introductions had the quality of someone who intended to remember the conversations rather than simply complete a checklist. Owen Clark and I began meeting for coffee every few weeks. This became a habit I found I looked forward to in a simple and uncomplicated way. He updated me on the liaison office's work. I told him what I could about the Reform Committee's progress. We talked about other things as well, about history and about institutions, and about the particular difficulty of changing systems that have settled into their shapes over a long time. He had thought carefully about most of the things I had thought carefully about, and had useful perspectives on them. He mentioned Grace Calloway in one of our early meetings. He had visited her on Aldenmere, he said. She was well. She had a garden and a community clinic where she volunteered twice a week. She had asked about me when she heard about the meeting at Lismore Station. I asked what she had said. He smiled. He said she had asked whether I seemed like someone who was sleeping adequately, because from the photograph she had seen of me in a council communications brief, I looked like someone who was not. I laughed, which surprised me. A genuine laugh, the kind that arrives before you have decided to produce it. The reform process moved at the pace that serious reform moves, which is not fast, and is not comfortable, and is not the pace that the people who need it most want it to move at. There were setbacks. A vote on revised security oversight protocols stalled for 4 cycles over a jurisdictional language dispute that was small, in a way I found almost offensive given everything that had preceded it, but which mattered to the parties involved and therefore required real engagement. Two delegations withdrew from the Reform Committee at separate points over separate concerns, and both returned after extended negotiation that tested everyone's patience, including mine. The infrastructure maintenance framework, which should have been straightforward given that we now held comprehensive documentation of what proper maintenance required, generated far more argument than the situation merited before finally passing with one dissenting vote. One dissenting vote. That was a better outcome than the previous version of this council would have produced for the same proposal, and I held on to that fact through the difficult stretches. The relay network reached full operational status in the 11th month of the repair schedule. Every node in the affected sectors was operating at specification for the first time in longer than anyone on the engineering team had been in their current positions. Dre's final report included a summary paragraph stating that the network was in better condition than at any point in the previous 20 cycles, and that the documentation protocols established during the repair process would prevent comparable degradation from developing without detection in the future. I kept that report. I kept several documents from this period that I did not strictly need to retain, because I had spent enough time discovering the cost of records not being kept well to understand exactly what they were worth. The Marath delegation submitted a formal proposal in the cycle following the relay restoration. It established a structured early warning mechanism through which member delegations could raise systemic concerns to a dedicated review body with a guaranteed response timeline. It was well designed and clearly informed by the specific experience of having concerns go unanswered over a long period of time. It passed on its second submission, which felt like meaningful progress. Owen Clark attended the ceremony when that proposal passed. He sat in the back of the room without speaking during the proceedings, but he was there, and I noticed him. We had coffee the following week, and I asked what had brought him. He said he had been keeping a list of things that indicated the reform process was real rather than procedural, and the Marath proposal passing was on the list. I asked how long the list was getting. He thought about this. Then he said it was getting longer. Something in the way he said it made me think of Caroline Holt gathering her notes at the end of the last session she ever attended, walking out of the grand convocation hall through doors I had walked through 10,000 times. I had thought about her often during this period. I had tried to understand what she must have felt walking out that day, whether she was sad or resolved, or something that did not have a simpler name, whether she had looked back at seat 7 as she went out. I decided she had not because she had stopped caring, because she had already decided, and she was the kind of person who, having decided, moved. The Kreth Sovereignty submitted a formal inquiry about observer status at the Council, 18 months after the Naren corridor situation resolved. The inquiry was processed through proper channels, reviewed over several months, and declined on grounds that were specific and documented and explicitly left open to revisitation if circumstances changed. Vassal managed the process himself. The Kreth Sovereignty's diplomatic office replied acknowledging the decision. That exchange, ordinary as its form appeared, would not have happened that way 2 years earlier. The framework required to produce it had not existed before. I noted this in the documentation I was beginning to prepare for my successor, because I wanted the record to contain not only the failures and what they had cost, but also the specific, granular evidence that something was actually changing. My final year as senior mediator was busy with work that felt qualitatively different from the busyness of the previous 30 years. Not the volume, the direction. Things were moving towards something rather than producing the same landscape in each successive cycle, and the difference between those two kinds of movement is significant and not always easy to sustain. I prepared a complete historical account of the 43 rotations, beginning with Caroline Holt's last session and ending with the current moment, and I placed it in the Council's formal archives under a heading chosen to make it findable by anyone who was looking. I wrote it in the specific, detailed way of a person who wants a record to last and to be genuinely usable by the people who read it after them. I put Grace Calloway's name in that document. I put Oliver Webb's name in it, the 26-year-old who had written the careful, uninformative messages while the situation developed around him, and whose name deserved to be in the record for that reason. I put the number 412 in it, and the number 31, and I wrote about the gap between them in the way it deserved to be written about, which is with full and specific understanding of what that gap had produced. I put Caroline Holt's final line in the document. I included it in full, without reduction, in the document that would sit in the Council's formal archive alongside the session records and the infrastructure assessments and the engineering reports and everything else from this period. We are not leaving because we gave up on this institution. We are leaving because we can no longer pretend that staying is the same thing as being heard. The document was long. I did not shorten it. On the morning of my last day, I did one final thing before I went to the Grand Convocation Hall. I went to the Council's record archive, and I looked up the entry for the Human Delegation's 47th item, the item about Grace Calloway. I found it in the same misfiled folder where S had found it months before, still sitting under the same budget heading, still attached to the same internal review document. The entry had been accessed 11 times since I had discovered it, which meant that the people who had been working on the acknowledgement document and the Reform Committee's background research had found it as well. 11 accesses in several months for a document that had sat untouched for 11 cycles. I closed the archive and walked to the hall. I had been thinking, during the final weeks, about what it meant to hand this work to someone else. My successor was capable and thorough, and had been briefed fully on everything that had happened and everything that was underway. She understood the reform process and the liaison office, and the relationship with the human delegation, and the history of the 43 rotations. She was ready. What I could not give her was the specific quality of having been in the room when the emergency session happened, of having stood at the mediator's podium and watched Prahl put down his reading device, of having sat at the small table in Lismore Station while Margaret Osei described the internal assembly discussions with the kind of honesty that required something from the person receiving it, of having read the Meredith message and understood, in a way that the words themselves did not fully contain, what it had meant to the people who sent it to have someone finally say it. Those things lived in a person's understanding in a different way than they lived in a document, and no document I could write would transfer them. The best I could do was write clearly enough that the document was useful to someone who had not been there, and I believed I had done that. What the document could not do, the account of this period and the lessons it contained, and the reforms that were underway, was guarantee that the lessons would be retained. Institutions have short memories. They have structural short memories, built into the way they organize information and train new staff, and relate to their own history. A lesson learned at significant cost can become, within a generation of personnel turnover, a fact about the past that is acknowledged without being understood. I had written the account the way I wrote it because I wanted to make that as difficult as possible. I had been as specific as I could be. I had used names and numbers and dates. I had described item 47 in full, and had included Grace Calloway's specific patient numbers and the specific status of the assistance request that had been pending review when I found it. I had included Caroline Holt's final line, because it was the kind of sentence that is hard to read quickly and move past, that requires you to stop on it, and stopping on it was what I needed future readers to do. I do not know whether it will be sufficient. I know it is what I was able to do, and that it was done carefully, and that the record exists in a place where it can be found. That is what the work allowed. Owen Clark had coffee ready when I stopped by the liaison office on my way out of the building. He had known it was my last day, and had made the coffee and set it on the table by his window without making anything of it, which was characteristic of him. I sat with him for 20 minutes and we talked about small things, about the city outside the window and about a history volume we had both been reading, and about the ice formations at Lismore Station, which I had described to him once, and which he said he intended to see when he next made the journey to human space. At the door, I thanked him. He said there was nothing to thank him for. I said there was quite a lot to thank him for, actually, but that I would leave the complete list for another time. He smiled and said he would hold me to that. I walked out through the eastern door of the administrative wing, into the bright morning, carrying nothing but the notebook I always carried, and the knowledge that the work was continuing without me, in the hands of people who understood what it was for. On my last day as senior mediator, I arrived at the Grand Convocation Hall before anyone else. The morning light came in through the high windows at the angle it takes in the earliest part of the day, low and long, and slightly golden, crossing the floor and the rows of empty seats in the way it had crossed them every morning I had worked in this building for 30 years. The hall was empty, and the quiet had the quality of a space that has held many different things and is in the process of being something new. Seat 7 had a new placard. It said Observer, in the same clean typography as all the other placards, because the Human Liaison Office had submitted a formal administrative request for the change, and the change had been made through proper process. I had signed the approval myself, and when I had signed it, I thought I would feel the change as something lost, a diminishment, a record of absence where there had been presence. Standing in the empty hall looking at the placard, I did not feel that. What I felt was harder to name, but had to do with honesty. The Observer placard was what the relationship actually was. Not the old arrangement, in which human work had sustained a structure that refused to acknowledge the work or the workers. Not the fiction of full membership coexisting with 3 decades of formal requests going unread. Something that was what it said it was, which is rarer in institutions than it should be, and more valuable than it appears when you encounter it. In the eastern wing, through the walls and the corridors between, the liaison office lights were coming on. I stood at seat 7 and let myself stand there for a while. I thought about 43 rotations of an empty chair, and what those rotations had revealed about what the chair had meant when it was filled. I thought about 412 documents and 31 responses, and the precise, measurable harm that the gap between those numbers had produced. I thought about the relay nodes failing 31 rotations in rather than 60, because the baseline we had calculated from turned out not to reflect reality. I thought about the Kreth observer in the gallery, sitting through my detailed presentation of every gap and vulnerability, and about the corridor of 14 rotations between that session and 3 vessels in the Naren corridor. I thought about Caroline Holt adding that final line to a memo she must have known would not be read in time to change what was already in motion. She had added it anyway, because she was a person who still believed the right words might find someone who needed them. Sometimes they do. Not always in the time frame that would have helped. But sometimes later. Sometimes that has to be enough. I walked out of the hall and down through the eastern corridor, and sat in a corridor seat near the liaison office, and opened my communications terminal. I wrote a message to a retired medical officer on a world called Aldenmere, who had a garden and a community clinic where she volunteered twice each week. A woman who had stood up at an assembly meeting and said she thought it was worth trying, that she had not regretted the work, but only the silence around it, and that she would like to think the silence might be over. I told her things were improving, not as fast as they should have been improved a long time ago, and not without difficulty, and not finished, but improving in the specific, concrete, measurable sense that the work was being done now by the people who were supposed to be doing it. The documentation existed and was being maintained. The gaps were being filled through deliberate institutional effort rather than anyone's quiet and unacknowledged labor. The record was complete and correct and preserved in a place where it would be found. I told her her name was in the council's formal archives now, in a document that described what she had done and what it had meant, and why it should not go unrecorded. I told her that what she had done at the Relief Post Clinic for 8 cycles was in the permanent record of this institution, as it should have been all along. I told her I was grateful to her. I said it in specific terms rather than formal ones, because she had earned the specific and honest version, not the diplomatic one. Then I closed the terminal and stood up. My successor was briefed and ready. The Reform Committee was meeting in 3 days without me, as it should, as it would continue to do for as long as the work required. Owen Clark was in his office with the lights on. The relay network was at full operation for the first time in 20 cycles. The processing stations were staffed. The Naren corridor was quiet. None of it was finished. This kind of work does not finish. The work of making an institution honest about the gap between what it claims to be and what it actually is, and of closing that gap through sustained, documented, unglamorous effort, is not the kind of work that reaches an ending. It is the kind of work that requires someone to keep doing it, and to keep being honest about how it is going, and to keep the records in a way that prevents the comfortable forgetting that institutions always tend toward when forgetting is easier than remembering. That was what this work had always been. That was what it would remain for whoever held it after me. I walked out of the building into the open air of the morning. The city was doing what cities do at that hour, beginning without needing to be told, moving at the steady pace of ordinary life that continues alongside the larger movements of institutions and history, without much awareness of them, and which is, in the end, what those movements are supposed to be for. The work had been handed off. The work was continuing. That was enough. Not everything. Not finished. But enough to walk out into the morning with. And enough to give to the person who would carry it forward. And enough to send across space to a woman with a garden on a world called Aldenmere, as evidence that the silence, imperfectly and incompletely, and with a great deal still remaining to do, might indeed be over. The morning was bright. The work went on.